Welcome fellow lit seekers! In this video, we will be exploring two influential literary theories, New Historicism and Cultural Materialism. Together, we'll uncover how texts were shaped by history, culture, power, and ideology, and how literature both reflects and challenges the world around it. Join us as we break down their key concepts, connect them to real examples, and understand how these approaches deepen our reading and interpretation of literary works. Let's go! Today, we will be discussing about New Historicism and Cultural Materialism. Now, New Historicism and Cultural Materialism emerged in the 1980s as approaches to literary analysis that emphasize historical and cultural context. Now, these theories view text as product of their time, shaped by power dynamics and ideological forces, rejecting the idea of universal meaning. Key figures like Stephen Greenblatt and Raymond Williams developed these approaches, combining close reading with historical analysis. They explore how texts reflect and shape cultural values, challenging traditional literary criticism by focusing on the relationship between literature, power, and social change. Now, let us dive deeper into these theories, starting with New Historicism. New Historicism emerged as a literary theory in the late 1970s and the early 1980s during a time of political and social upheaval in the United States. The civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and the anti-war movement were all shaping the cultural landscape, and scholars in the humanities were increasingly interested in exploring the relationship between literature and the society. Now, the emergence of New Historicism can also be seen as a response to the limitations of the earlier literary theories such as New Criticism and Formalism. Now, these approaches tended to focus on the literary text itself and its formal elements rather than the social and historical context in which it was produced. It is an interdisciplinary approach to literary criticism that examines literature in the context of the historical and cultural circumstances in which it was produced. New Historicism emphasizes the interrelationship between literature and history and the ways in which power relations, social norms, and cultural practices are reflected and contested in literary texts. It emphasizes the importance of understanding the social and political context in which a text was produced and the ways in which that context shaped the meaning and reception of the text. Now, New Historicists believe that all cultural artifacts, including literature, are embedded in the social and political structures of their time. Therefore, they argue that it is impossible to fully understand a literary work without understanding the social and political context in which it was produced. This includes analyzing not only the text itself, but also the historical events, cultural norms, and power relations that were present at the time of its creation. Now, New Historicism also stresses the idea that history is not fixed or objective reality, but is rather a series of interpretations and narratives that are constantly being constructed and reconstructed by those in power. Therefore, New Historicists are interested in exploring how literary texts participate in the ongoing process of creating and shaping our history. Now that we learned about New Historicism, let us now know what are the key concepts in New Historicism. Begin with its key concept, the first one, which is context. Now, New Historicism is grounded in the belief that a literary text cannot be separated from the historical and cultural context in which it was produced. For New Historicists, literature is not an isolated creation of an author's imagination. Instead, it emerges from the social, political, economic, and cultural forces of its time. A text reflects the norms, anxieties, conflicts, and power structures of the era that produced it. Thus, to understand a literary work fully, one must examine the conditions surrounding its production, such as prevalent beliefs, political tensions, social hierarchies, and cultural practices. The historical context becomes as important as the text itself, shaping its meaning and reception. Now, another important concept is cultural poetics, which looks at literature as part of a broader network of cultural practices. New historians study how texts engage with rituals, customs, laws, social behaviors, and institutions of their time. Now, instead of treating literature as superior or separate from other cultural artifacts, cultural poetics places literary works alongside historical documents, speeches, diaries, and even popular culture. The goal is to understand how texts participate in the complex cultural dialogues of their era. Now, literature is viewed as a site where cultural meanings are produced, negotiated, and sometimes challenged. For the third one, we have contingency, which is also central to New Historicism. This concept emphasizes that history is not fixed, linear, or predetermined. Instead, history is shaped by unpredictable events, individual decisions, shifting power relations, and cultural forces. New historians reject the idea that history moves toward a single clear outcome. Instead, they highlight how chance, accidents, and small details can influence significant historical developments. This approach reveals the fluidity and uncertainty of both history and interpretation, showing that meanings, both historical and literary, are not absolute but subject to change. And for the fourth one, New historians are deeply interested in power and discourse, drawing from Michel Foucault's ideas that power operates through language and knowledge systems. They argue that discourse, how people speak, write, and think about certain topics, is shaped by those who hold power in society. Language is not neutral. It reflects and reinforces power relationships. When analyzing a text, New historians examine how power circulates through its language, how it constructs authority, and how it participates in the dominant discourses of its time. Now, literature becomes a tool through which societies negotiate power, identity, and social order. Another key concept is intertextuality. It is the idea that all texts are interconnected and constantly in dialogue with one another. Literary works echo, reshape, or respond to other texts, whether consciously or unconsciously. New historians use intertextuality to show how meaning is never created in isolation, but rather, it is built through relationships with other writing, historical documents, and cultural narratives. Now, this interconnectedness allows scholars to trace how ideas circulate across different periods, genres, and cultural forms. Lastly, New historicism explores how literature helps construct, reinforce, or question ideology, the shared beliefs, values, and assumptions that shaped how people view the world. For New historicists, literary texts do not merely reflect ideology. They actively participate in its creation and dissemination by presenting characters, events, and social norms in particular ways. Literature can uphold dominant ideologies or compose contradictions and tensions within them. Thus, analyzing a literary work through a new historicist lens involves examining how it contributes to cultural beliefs and power structures. Another theory is cultural materialism. Cultural materialism examines how literature reflects and shapes society's economic and political conditions. It focuses on the material context of literary production and consumption, exploring how texts are influenced by and reinforce dominant ideologies. Now, to understand more about cultural materialism, it is an approach to literary and cultural analysis that seeks to understand how society and culture influence each other. It views culture as a material force that is shaped by economic and political power structures, and that these power structures are often reflected in the literature produced by a society or a culture. Now, this approach sees literary works as products of their historical context and social conditions, and it argues that they can be used to understand the cultural and ideological systems that underpin them. It seeks to understand how meaning is created in literary works and how these works reflect the ideological struggles that occur within a society or a culture. Now, when we say cultural materialism, it acknowledges the importance of historical context and the social, economic, and political conditions in which a text was created, and it recognizes that these conditions can influence the themes, the characters, and symbols present in a work of literature. Through this perspective, literary analysis involves an examination of both the content and form of literary works, as well as an exploration of the historical and sociocultural context in which they were produced. Now, this is cultural materialism. Now, what are the key concepts of cultural materialism? The first key concept is base and superstructure. Cultural materialism is grounded in the idea that society is shaped by the relationship between the economic base and the cultural superstructure. The economic base, composed of the means of production such as land, factories, technology, and the relations of production between owners and workers, it determines the material conditions of life. These material conditions, in return, it influences the cultural and ideological superstructure, which includes art, literature, religion, education, politics, and social values. According to this perspective, cultural products do not emerge independently. Rather, they reflect and reinforce the economic system that sustains society. For example, in a capitalist society that prioritizes profit and competition, cultural works often promote individualism and success as natural ideals. We have hegemony. It is a term developed by Antonio Gramsci to explain how the dominant class maintains power, not primarily through force, but through the willing consent of subordinate classes. The ruling class achieves this by spreading its ideology through institutions such as the media, education, religion, and popular culture. Over time, these ideas becomes accepted as common sense, making them appear natural and unquestionable. An example of this is the belief that success comes solely from hard work, which hides structural inequalities and prevents people from questioning the larger system that shapes their opportunities. Now, for the third one, we have ideology, which refers to the system of beliefs, values, and ideas that shape how individuals understand the world and their place within it. When we say ideologies, it functions to justify existing social relations and present inequalities as normal or inevitable. Examples include individualism, which suggests that people succeed or fail only because of their personal efforts. We also have consumerism, which encourages people to find value and identity through material possessions, and nationalism, which promotes loyalty to the nation while often masking internal inequalities. Now, these ideologies become internalized, influencing everyday behavior and the way people interpret social reality. And lastly, we have power relations. Cultural materialism examines power relations, emphasizing how power and resources are unequally distributed among different social groups. These inequalities can be seen in class divisions between the bourgeoisie, which are the owners of production, and the proletariat, the workers. In gender hierarchies that privilege men over women. In racial structures that favor white individuals over non-white. And in sexual norms that marginalize LGBTQ identities while privileging the heterosexuality. These power relations shape access to opportunities, representation, and decision-making in society. Cultural texts such as literature, films, and media often reflect, reinforce, or challenge these power structures, making them key sites for cultural materialist analysis. Now, for us to understand more about New Historicism and cultural materialism, let us now discuss about the development of these theories and the key theories and relevant figures during this period. This will be discussed to you by Mr. Pulgo.
Okay, now let's talk about the theory development. First is the origin and development of historicism. New historicism emerged in the late 1970s and early 1980s as a reaction to text-centered criticism, arguing that literature must be understood in connection with his historical and cultural context. Influenced by Michel Foucault's ideas on power, it views both literature and historical as shaped by social forces rather than being neutral. This approach encourages studying literary works alongside historical documents, which help establish new historicism as a major method in modern literary analysis. This development occurred during a period when literary scholars were becoming dissatisfied with purely formalist approaches like new criticism, which ignored historical circumstances because of his growing dissatisfaction. New historicism encouraged the study of literature alongside diaries, letters, government documents, legal records, and other historical materials. This broadened the scope of literary analysis and helped New Historicism rise as one of the major critical frameworks in modern literary studies. Now, let's proceed to the key theories and contribution in New Historicism. Now, let us have first Stephen Greenblatt. Now, who is Stephen Greenblatt? He introduced and popularized the historicism in literary studies, especially through his book Renaissance, Self-Fashioning in 1980. Emphasized that literature is shaped by and helped shape the social, political, and cultural power structures of its time. Highlighted the concept of self-fashioning, showing how individuals construct identities influenced by cultural focus and authority. And more or less, Greenblatt's more work gave scholars practical model for examining how authors, characters, and societies mold identity through ideological pressure, making him the central figure of the movement. And the second one is Michel Foucault. Now, who is Michel Foucault? He developed the idea that power and knowledge are interconnected, influencing how societies define truth and construct meaning. Introduced the concept of discourses, which shape how people understand themselves, history, and culture. Now, he also studied institutions, for example, the prisons, clinic, schools, to show how they control individuals through disciplinary power, a key foundation for new historical thinking. Now, although not a literary critic, Foucault's theories laid the foundation for new historicism by explaining how societies regulate through thought and behavior, encouraging critics to examine literature as part of these power systems. Okay, now the third one is Louis Montrose. Who is Louis Montrose? Coined the phrase the textuality of history and the historicity of text, central to new historicist methodology. Emphasized that literature and history constantly shape and reflect each other, rather than being separate realms. Also advocated for analyzing literature through cultural context, acknowledging authorial intention, readership, and social conditions. To elaborate, Montrose helped broaden new historicism by showing that texts are not merely reflections of history, but active agents participating in cultural production. Now, last but not the least is Louis Althusser. Now, who is Louis Althusser? Introduced the concept of ideological state apparatuses, or ISAS. ISAS or ISAS? Institutions like schools, religion, and media that shape people's belief and behaviors. Also argued that individuals are interpolated or constructed by ideology, influencing how new historicists understand characters, formation, and identity. He also helped shift criticism toward examining how texts participate in and resist dominant ideologies within their historical moment. To elaborate, Althusser helped new historicists understand literature not only as cultural expression but as a tool that can reinforce or challenge power and ideology in society. Now let's proceed to the origin and development of cultural materialism. Now, cultural materialism developed in the late 1970s in Britain as a Marxist-influenced counterpart to New Historicism, defining literature as a cultural product embedded in material conditions, class struggles, and ideological state structures, with emphasis on political resistance and social change. Its development was strongly shaped by British leftist scholarship and activism, especially during times of political upheaval, which led scholars to view literary studies as a means of questioning authority and advocating reform.
Hello everyone, my name is Nico Vince Marquez Binsa, and now I'm gonna be discussing the key theorists of cultural materialism and their major contributions. Now, let's start with Raymond Williams. He is considered the founder of cultural materialism. Williams argued that culture is not separated from society, but instead, it is shaped by political, economic, and social conditions. He also introduced important ideas like dominant, residual, and emergent cultures, which help explain how different cultural forces compete in society. Now, for the second theorist is Jonathan Dwyer-Moore. His work focuses on literature, exposes power structures. Dwyer-Moore highlighted the idea of subversion, meaning that some texts challenge or undermine dominant beliefs and institutions. He often analyzed Renaissance drama to show how literature questioned authority. Now for the last theorist is Alan Sinfield. Sinfield emphasized that literature is deeply political and connected to issues like class, gender, and sexuality. He also studied marginalized groups such as LGBTQ plus communities are represented or silenced in cultural texts. His work shows how literature can resist or reshape ideology. Overall, these three theorists contributed to the idea that literature is not just an art. It is a site of struggle where power, politics, and society interact.
Good day everyone. At this portion, let us discuss about the assumptions and methods in analyzing texts in New Historicism and cultural materialism. Let's begin with the assumptions about New Historicism. Now, one of the literary critics and scholars is Harold Aram Visser, who helped define and shape New Historicism as a major critical approach in literary studies. In his edition of the book The New Historicism, he identified 5 assumptions. These assumptions help explain how literature is connected to history, power, culture, and society. His first assumption states that every expressive act is embedded in a network of material practices, meaning every piece of writing such as novel, poem, speech, diary, and so on is shaped by the author's culture, their historical reality, their social position, the political and economic systems around them. An author cannot escape their context. Their text always carries traces of the society they lived in. New historists analyze literature as part of history, not separate from it. His second assumption states that every act of unmasking, critic, and opposition uses the tools it condemns. This means even critics who try to expose a problem such as racism, sexism, capitalism, and so on are still shaped by the same systems they criticize. They cannot escape their own biases, their values, or historical position. For example, a critic who analyzes Noli Me Tangere to expose the abuses of colonialism still uses Western literary theories, Western academic structures, and the Spanish language through translations and historical documents. all of which were introduced by colonial powers. So, even while they critique colonization, they are using tools shaped by colonization itself. In simple idea, the second assumption says you can't step outside the system you're criticizing. You are still part of it. The third assumption says literary and non-literary texts circulate inseparably. What does that mean? That means there is no text that is more important than another just because it is high literature. To understand a historical period, we must study all kinds of writing, not only famous novels and poems, but also literature such as newspapers, diaries, laws, reports, letters, and even advertisements. All these texts reveal what people believed, feared, desired, and experienced in that time. The fourth assumption, no discourse, imaginative or archival, gives access to unchanging truths nor expresses inalterable human nature. New historicism rejects the idea that literature reveals a permanent, universal human truth. Every text only expresses the beliefs and values of its historical moment. In other words, there are no fixed universal truths, only historically shaped beliefs. For example, let's use the film Shakespeare in Love. We've observed that women were not allowed to perform on stage during Shakespeare's time. Only men and boys acted, and it was even considered sinful or improper. This practice reflected the cultural beliefs, religious views, and gender norms of the Elizabethan era, not some timeless truth about women. But in today's world, women freely perform on stage, direct plays, and star in films. This shows that gender roles and ideas about morality are not universal truths. They change as society changes. What's unacceptable before is accepted today. That is to say, truth changes. Human nature is actually alterable. Now, the last assumption about new historicism, according to Visser, states that a critical method and a language adequate to describe culture under capitalism participate in the economy they describe. New historists often critique power systems like capitalism, but by publishing books, working at universities, and being paid by academic institutions, they themselves participate in the same system they criticize. Critics cannot stand outside the economic system. They are part of that system. For example, a scholar writes a book criticizing capitalist exploitation. This book is sold for profit. The scholar earns a salary at a university funded by student tuition, which is part of capitalist structures. So even critic becomes part of the said system. And those are the assumptions about new historicism according to Harold Aron Visser. Moving forward, here are the methods in applying and analyzing texts in new historicism. First, research the historical context. New historicism believes a text cannot be understood alone. You must know the time, place, and social conditions in which it was produced. In this method, you look at what was happening politically, socially, and culturally during that period. This helps you see how the text reflects or responds to real historical issues. Second, examine the author's background. Although new historians do not rely only on the author's life, they still study the author's social position, beliefs, and experiences. This helps you understand how the author might have been influenced by their historical moment. But the author is seen as a product of history, not the sole creator of meaning. For example, in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, Austen lived in a society where women depended on marriage for financial security. Her own experiences with limited career options for women help explain why the novel focuses so much on marriage, class, and economic survival. Third, compare literary text with non-literary text. A trademark of New Historicism is reading literature alongside historical documents such as letters, diaries, laws, sermons, and newspaper articles. New historians treat all of this as equal cultural artifacts. Here, you compare how both the literary and non-literary texts express values and beliefs of the same era. Next, identify power dynamics. Influenced by Michel Foucault, New Historicism focuses heavily on power, who has it, who doesn't, and how it is maintained. In a text, you look for oppression or resistance, class conflict, gender roles, political control, and institutions such as church, monarchy, school, and so on. The goal here is to see how the text supports or challenges the dominant ideology of its time. For example, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. The regime controls women's bodies and limits their literacy. This reflects real historical and contemporary systems where gendered power restricts women's freedom. The novel becomes both a reflection and critic of patriarchal structures. Fifth, analyze cultural beliefs and social norms. New historians examine how the text represents the cultural values of its time, such as morality, gender expectations, racial beliefs, and economic systems. In this method, you study how these ideas shape people's behavior and how the text reflects or critiques them. For example, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. The obsession with wealth, excess, and social status reflects the American dream culture of the 1920s. The book both showcases and criticizes the cultural values of the Jazz Age, especially its moral emptiness and class divisions. Last method, look for historical allusions or references. If the text mentions or hints at real historical events, people, or places, you analyze why the author included it, how this event shapes the meaning, what the text may be saying about society's issues. This helps connect the text directly to historical conversations. For example, in the novel 1984 by George Orwell, the novel alludes to Stalinist Russia, Nazi Germany, and Cold War surveillance. These historical references reveal Orwell's warning about totalitarianism and political manipulation. Knowing the historical parallels deepens the text's meaning. In continuation, here are the ways in analyzing text in New Historicism. First, what issues does the text address? New Historicism assumes that all texts, whether they admit it or not, engage with the political, social, and cultural concerns of their time. Here, you examine what fears or anxieties the text reflects, what debates or conflicts it participates in, what dominant ideologies it supports or questions. Sometimes the issues are obvious, but often they are hidden beneath symbols, plot events, or character actions. Second, how does the tax reflect its time? A tax is shaped by the systems of meaning available in its era. Laws, economics, religion, social roles, scientific beliefs, and so on. New historicism looks at how the text mirrors these systems, not as background but as forces shaping meaning. For example, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. The story reflects Victorian beliefs about charity, social reform, industrialization, and moral responsibility. Scrooge's transformation echoes the era's concerns about capitalism's harsh effects and the need for social conscience. Third, how does the text influence its time? Texts don't just reflect society, they can also shape attitudes, inspire change, reinforce norms, or challenge institutions. In this way, you ask, how were readers affected? Did the text provoke controversy, inspire reform, or support power structures? For example, in the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe that was published in 1852, it influenced public opinion on slavery in America. Many historians agree that the novel helped fuel abolitionist sentiment and contributed to growing tensions before the Civil War. Lastly, analyze the text and new historicism by asking this way: how do the author and reader fit in? Both the author and the reader are shaped by their historical and cultural context. New historicism does not see meaning as fixed. Instead, the author writes from the perspective of their time. Readers interpret from their own time and cultural assumptions. This creates shifting meanings depending on who reads the text and when. For example, let's use the 1984 again by George Orwell. Orwell wrote after witnessing totalitarian regimes, so the novel reflects Cold War anxieties. A modern reader like us might instead focus on surveillance technology, privacy invasion, and fake news. In other words, same text in different interpretations based on historical position. Those were the methods in applying and analyzing text in new historicism. Let's move on now to the assumptions about cultural materialism. According to Frank Elwell in 2006, referring on the work of Marvin Harris, cultural materialism is based on two key assumptions. First, society is made up of component parts that are functionally interrelated. Second, the foundation of sociocultural systems is the environment. What do this mean? In the first assumption, cultural materialism believes that society works like one big connected system. Every part of society, family, economy, politics, religion, culture, schools affects the others. So you cannot understand one part without looking at what's happening in the others. When one part of society changes, the other parts must adjust. This is because all parts depend on each other to keep society functioning. Why this happens? Each institution or cultural practice exists for a reason. It performs a function. If the economy changes, families must adopt. If beliefs change, behaviors change. If laws change, social expectations shift. Everything is linked. For example, changes in families like more divorces, smaller families, and more single parents didn't happen just because people changed their minds. Cultural materialism says these family changes are connected to economic changes. Living costs increase. More women joined the workforce. People needed two incomes. Jobs became more demanding. These economic pressures change how families operate. So that's how cultural materialism views social changes. The second major assumption states that the foundation of socio-cultural systems is the environment. Cultural materialism says that everything humans do is ultimately limited by the environment. Just like all living things, humans need energy and resources such as food, water, materials from nature in order to survive. So the key idea here is that even if humans create advanced technology, we cannot escape our dependence on natural resources. Yes, we can invent better tools to get more food, create machines to produce more goods, control population growth, but we cannot create new natural resources from nothing. We can only use what the environment already has. Environmental limits come in two forms. First, resource availability. These are food, water, land, minerals, and energy resources. Second, environmental tolerance. This is how much pollution or waste the environment and the people can absorb before harm occurs. Because these limits affect everyone. Any major change in how we use resources, for example, farming practices, energy systems, population growth, and industrialization, will create big changes in society's economic, political, and cultural systems. In simple idea, humans depend on nature for everything. No matter how advanced we become, we cannot escape environmental limits, and these limits shape how society works. And those were the two major assumptions about cultural materialism. Moving forward, here are the methods in applying and analyzing texts in cultural materialism. Cultural materialism analyzes texts by situating them within their specific historical, economic, and political context. It emphasizes that cultural products are not isolated works of art, but are shaped by and reflect the material conditions and power dynamics of the society in which they are produced. The first method is historicizing the text. Historicizing means analyzing a literary work as a product of its specific historical moment. So, we ask what social, economic, and political conditions shape the text's creation and meaning. For example, in No Le Metenier by José Rizal, the novel is understood through the late Spanish colonial context, where friar abuses, racism, and class inequality were widespread. These historical conditions shaped the novel's characters, such as the abusive friars. Themes such as oppression, injustice, and plot events like land grabbing and corruption. The second method refers to political commitment. Cultural materialism is openly political. It aligns with marginalized voices and critiques systems like colonialism, patriarchy, and authoritarianism. For example, let's use now the Philippine literatures as example. In Dekada 70 by Lualhati Bautista, the novel takes the perspective of ordinary citizens under Marcos martial law, highlighting state violence, gender inequality, and silence dissent. By focusing on Amanda and her sons, the text foregrounds voices affected by political oppression. So, cultural materialism analysis highlights how the novel resists authoritarian power and exposes the suffering of marginalized groups. Third, analyzing production and consumption. This method examines how the material conditions of publishing, media industries, and audience reception shape a text's meaning and influence. For example, Wattpad to film romance stories such as She's Dating the Gangster. These works are shaped by the commercial publishing industry, youth market demands, and film companies seeking high-profit stories. Their popularity is tied to social media culture, teenage fan bases, and marketing strategies. Cultural materialism shows that these texts are not just love stories but cultural products shaped by economic goals and mass media consumption. Next is identifying ideology and power relations. This is actually about analyzing how a text reinforces or challenges dominant ideologies such as class hierarchy, patriarchy, nationalism, or colonial mentality. For example, Mga Ibong Mandaragit by Amado V. Hernandez. The novel exposes class struggle, corruption, and the exploitation of peasants and workers. It challenges ruling elites and reveals how political and economic power keep the poor oppressed. Thus, a cultural materialism reading shows how the text critiques capitalist and imperialist ideologies. Next method is close textual analysis. Cultural materialism combines close reading such as examining language, imagery, dialogue with historical and political context to understand how form reflects ideology. Let's use another example. Ang Pag-ibig sa Tinubuang Lupa by Andres Bonifacio. Close reading reveals powerful urgent language such as Dakilang Pag-ibig, Tinubuang Lupa that inspires collective action. These textual elements encode the revolutionary spirit of the time, placing the passage in its context, the colonial oppression that shows the poem's ideological purpose, that is, to encourage resistance. Next is present relevance. This means analyzing historical texts not just for their past significance but for their relevance to contemporary social issues and political struggles by examining modern adaptations or rereadings. This method directs you to read historical texts for their relevance today, including modern adaptations highlighting current political and social issues. For example, the retellings or modern retellings of Ibong Adarna. Although centuries old, its modern adaptations reflect present-day issues like family dynamics, moral dilemmas, and Filipino heroism. The continued use of the story in schools connects historical values to contemporary cultural identity. Cultural materialism asks how the old text shapes and is reshaped by current social moralities. Lastly, valuing ordinary culture. Here, cultural materialism rejects the divide between high culture and popular culture. Everyday cultural forms are equally important for analyzing ideology. For example, the Glock 9's song Upuan and Serena. These popular songs critique political corruption, inequality, gender discrimination, and social injustice. Although not high literature, they reveal deep ideological tensions in Filipino society. Cultural materialism treats these songs as meaningful texts that circulate political critique among ordinary people. And that's all for my part. I hope you have grasped those discussions about the assumptions and methods in applying and analyzing texts in new historicism and cultural materialism. Once again, good day.
Good day, everyone. So now let's proceed with critics and responses of New Historicism. So critics of New Historicism argue that it reduces literature to sociology, diminishes individual agency by overemphasizing cultural forces, and risk relativism and determinism. So what do you mean by this? So new historicism is often criticized for the following reason. First, it turns literature into sociology, meaning instead of treating novels, poems, and plays as art, new historicism treats them like social documents. So critics think it focuses too much on society and history and not enough on literary beauty. Second, it ignores the writer's personal choice. So new historicism says culture and power shape everything, so critics argue it leaves very little room for individual creativity or free will. Third one, it leads to relativism, meaning it avoids claiming one correct interpretation, or some people see this as confusing or unhelpful because it suggests there is no stable meaning. And lastly, it becomes deterministic. So it can seem like new historicism says everything is controlled by culture or history and that individuals cannot shape meaning. Now, let's see how new historicism respond to that. In response, new criticism highlight that this approach is not meant to diminish art, but to provide a more complex understanding of how texts are shaped by and reflect history's power dynamics and cultural discourses. So new historicists respond that the goal is to reveal how power operates and to show the limitation of achieving a single, objective, original meaning. Okay, so new historicists reply to these criticisms by saying, we're not trying to destroy art, just deepen understanding. So they argue that looking at history and power does not erase artistic value. Instead, it reveals hidden influences and meanings. Next one is texts are shaped by power and culture. Okay, so every story reflects the time and place it came from. So they said understanding those power structures help us understand the text. Lastly, there is no single or original meaning. So they argue that it is impossible to know exactly what the author meant or how people understood the text when it was first written. So instead of searching for a true meaning, we should explore how different contexts create different meaning. Now let's proceed with the critics and responses of cultural materialism. First, we have critics of materialism. Critics of cultural materialism include its overemphasis on material and economic factors, which critics argue is reductionist and can ignore the role of ideas, beliefs, and human agencies. So critics argue that cultural materialism pays too much attention to things like money, class, economic systems, material conditions like food, technology, land resources, and they say this becomes reductionist, meaning it reduces everything to economics. Critics also think that cultural materialism does not give enough importance to religion, morality, philosophy, imagination, and individual creativity. They worry that the theory treats people like they are only shaped by economics, not by their own thoughts or choices. Lastly, critics also say that if everything is shaped by economic system, then human decision and creativity is seen as less important. In response to that, cultural materialism emphasizes that the theory does not deny the influence of the superstructure, but rather sees it as a product of material conditions, which still allows for analysis of how cultural products can both reflect and subvert dominant structures. Cultural materialism has also been defended for its ability to provide concrete, empirical explanation for cultural practices and its focus on power dynamics that are often overlooked. So this means that cultural materialism does not deny the existence of ideas, beliefs, or ideology. They just believe these things come from material conditions, like beliefs, religion, and culture are shaped by the economic and social environment. Also, they agree that there is a superstructures, like ideas, politics, religion, but they argue that it is influenced by the material based and it can still affect society. It can also resist or challenge dominant power. So thoughts and culture do matter, they just have material roots. They also emphasize that literature and culture do not only mirror society, but they can also criticize it, expose inequalities, and challenge dominant ideologies. So cultural materialism allows for resistance and agency. Now that's all for critics and responses of new historicism and cultural materialism. To wrap things up and share the final thoughts, let's have teacher Richelle again to conclude our presentation.
Now for the conclusion and summary, new historicism and cultural materialism offer powerful and dynamic approaches for understanding literature as a product of its historical, social, and ideological environments. Both frameworks emphasize that texts are not isolated artistic creations, but rather it is active participants in the circulation of cultural power, belief systems, and material conditions. Through the insights of key theories, these approaches reveal how literature reflects, reinforces, or challenges the dominant ideologies of its time. The theories also open space for examining marginalized voices, the politics of representation, and the interplay between culture and authority. While critics highlight issues, proponents argue that these theories deepen our understanding of the complexity surrounding the production and reception of text. Ultimately, new historicism and cultural materialism invite readers to view literature as a living, shifting dialogue between text, history, and culture, one that continues to evolve with each new interpretation. Now, new historicism centers on the idea that literary texts and historical context are inseparable, analyzing how power, discourse, and identity is shaped and reshaped by literature. Cultural materialism, while sharing these concerns, places greater emphasis on material conditions, political structures, and the role of ideology in shaping cultural production. Together, these approaches encourages readers to see literature not only as an artistic expression, but as an active participant in cultural struggles and societal transformation. Overall, new historicism and cultural materialism remain influential because they remind us that literature is always connected to real human experiences, social institutions, and the forces that shape culture. Their continued use in literary studies underscores their value in understanding not only the past but also the social dynamics that persist in the present. We've now reached the end of the lesson. I hope you learned a lot. Thank you very much for listening. See you again next time for another insightful discussion. Bye!